Picture this. It's 1943, somewhere in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. A German soldier crouches in a foxhole, watching a massive Soviet T-34 tank rumble toward him. The ground shakes. The metal beast is unstoppable. Or so it seems. The soldier lifts a simple tube onto his shoulder. It weighs about as much as a bag of groceries. He aims, squeezes the trigger, and whoosh, a rocket streaks out. 3 seconds later, that multi-ton war machine is a burning wreck. This wasn't some expensive, complicated weapon system. This was the Panzerfaust, and it changed warfare forever. But here's the crazy part. It cost about the same as 2 pairs of boots to manufacture. While other countries were pouring resources into expensive anti-tank guns, the Germans created something that a factory worker could learn to assemble in an afternoon and a soldier could master in minutes. The story of how this happened involves desperate innovation, brutal necessity, and one of the most lethal weapons ever put into the hands of ordinary infantry. By the time World War II ended, the Panzerfaust had destroyed more tanks than any other handheld weapon in history. And it all started with a problem that seemed impossible to solve. Let me take you back to where it all began, because understanding why the Panzerfaust was created tells you everything about why it became so devastatingly effective. In the early years of World War II, the German military had a serious problem on their hands, and it was rolling toward them on steel treads. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, their tanks dominated. When they swept through France in 1940, their armored divisions seemed invincible. But then came Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and suddenly the Germans weren't facing outdated French tanks or light Polish armor. They were facing the T-34. The Soviet T-34 was a game-changer. It had sloped armor that deflected shots, a powerful gun, wide tracks for crossing rough terrain, and it was produced in absolutely massive numbers. German tankers, who had felt invincible just months before, suddenly found themselves outgunned and outnumbered. But here's the thing about tank warfare. You don't need another tank to kill a tank. Throughout history, the best tank killers have often been hidden soldiers with the right weapon. The problem was that, in 1941, German infantry didn't really have the right weapon. They had anti-tank rifles, but these were becoming obsolete as armor got thicker. They had artillery and dedicated anti-tank guns, but these were heavy, required crews of multiple men, and couldn't be everywhere at once. They had magnetic mines that brave soldiers could attach to tanks, but that required getting close enough to touch the enemy vehicle, a suicide mission most of the time. What German commanders desperately needed was something portable, something powerful, something that any infantryman could use. And they needed it cheap because by 1943, Germany's resources were being stretched thin across multiple fronts. The answer came from a company called Hazig, and the weapon they developed was so simple it seemed almost primitive. But sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. Now, to understand why the Panzerfaust was revolutionary, you need to understand the technology behind it. Don't worry, I'm going to make this simple. Most anti-tank weapons up to this point worked like regular guns or cannons. They fired a solid projectile really, really fast, hoping the kinetic energy would punch through armor. This required long barrels, powerful propellants, and a lot of weight. It also required the shooter to be pretty skilled because you had to account for bullet drop, wind, and all sorts of other factors. The Panzerfaust worked completely differently. It used something called a shaped charge warhead, and the physics behind this is actually mind-blowing when you think about it. Here's how it worked. The warhead contained explosives arranged in a cone shape with a copper liner. When the explosive detonated, it didn't just blow up randomly. Instead, the shaped charge focused the explosive force into a super-hot jet of metal that could reach speeds of over 25,000 feet per second. This jet was so powerful and so concentrated that it could burn through steel armor like a blowtorch through butter. The beautiful part? This had nothing to do with how fast the projectile was traveling when it hit the tank. A shaped charge worked just as well whether it was going 500 feet per second or 50 feet per second. This meant the Panzerfaust didn't need a powerful propellant or a long barrel. It just needed to get the warhead to the tank, and then physics did the rest. The design was brilliantly simple. The weapon consisted of just 3 main parts: a disposable metal tube, a rocket-propelled warhead, and a simple trigger mechanism. That's it. No complicated reloading system, no precision machined parts, no expensive optics. A soldier would extend the simple flip-up sights, tuck the tube under his arm, aim at the tank and squeeze the trigger. The propellant would fire, sending the warhead flying toward the target at about 100 feet per second. Not particularly fast by weapon standards. But it didn't need to be fast. When that shaped charge hit, it could penetrate up to 200 millimeters of armor, which was enough to destroy any tank in the world at that time. And here's what made it truly revolutionary. After firing, the soldier just threw away the tube and grabbed another one. No cleaning, no maintenance, no hauling around heavy equipment. Just point, shoot, and dispose. But having a good design on paper meant nothing if Germany couldn't produce these weapons in massive numbers. And this is where the story gets both impressive and dark. By 1943, Germany's industrial capacity was under enormous strain. Allied bombing was targeting factories. Raw materials were becoming scarce. Skilled workers were being drafted into the military. The Nazi regime needed weapons that could be produced quickly, cheaply, and by unskilled labor. The Panzerfaust fit these requirements perfectly. It required no precision machining, no rare materials, no complex assembly processes. The tube was just stamped sheet metal. The warhead used readily available explosives. The trigger mechanism was so simple that it could be assembled by workers with minimal training. And I need to pause here to acknowledge something uncomfortable. Much of this manufacturing was done using forced labor and concentration camp prisoners. The efficiency and low cost of the Panzerfaust came, in part, from the Nazi regime's horrific exploitation of enslaved workers. This is an important historical reality that we cannot overlook, even when discussing the weapon's technical aspects. By 1944, German factories were churning out hundreds of thousands of Panzerfausts every month. The cost per unit was remarkably low. Estimates suggest around 30 Reichsmarks, or roughly the cost of 2 pairs of military boots. Compare this to an anti-tank gun that might cost thousands of Reichsmarks and require a crew and a vehicle to move it around. The weapon came in several versions with different ranges and penetration capabilities. The Panzerfaust 30 had an effective range of about 30 meters. The Panzerfaust 60 could reach 60 meters. Later versions extended this to 100 meters or more. But even the earliest versions were lethal in the close-quarters combat that characterized much of the fighting in cities and forests. Germany eventually produced over 8 million Panzerfausts during the war. Think about that number. 8 million disposable anti-tank weapons. That meant that by 1944, nearly every German infantry squad had access to tank-killing capability. A technology that had once required specialized anti-tank units was now in the hands of regular soldiers, old men in the Volkssturm militia, and even Hitler Youth members in the desperate final months of the war. So how effective was this weapon really? The numbers are staggering. Precise statistics from World War II are often unreliable, but historians estimate that the Panzerfaust and its slightly more sophisticated cousin, the Panzerschreck, accounted for destroying more Allied armor than any other German weapon system. Some estimates suggest that handheld anti-tank weapons like the Panzerfaust destroyed more tanks than German tanks themselves did. Let me put that in perspective. Germany spent enormous resources building Tigers, Panthers, and other formidable tanks. These were engineering marvels that required thousands of man-hours and precious resources. Yet a teenage soldier with a disposable tube costing 30 Reichsmarks could be just as effective at killing enemy armor. The psychological impact was immense. Allied tank crews, who had grown increasingly confident as German armor became scarcer, suddenly had to fear every window, every foxhole, every pile of rubble. The Panzerfaust turned urban warfare into a nightmare for armored units. During the Battle of Berlin in 1945, Soviet forces lost hundreds of tanks to Panzerfaust attacks launched from buildings and rubble. Young soldiers and old men, many with minimal training, were able to take on sophisticated Soviet armor and win. The narrow streets and destroyed buildings created perfect conditions for close-range ambushes. One famous example: a Hitler Youth member named Willy Hubner reportedly destroyed several Soviet tanks during the battle for Berlin using a Panzerfaust. He was just 16 years old. This wasn't about superior skill or years of training. It was about a weapon so simple and effective that even inexperienced soldiers could use it lethally. American and British forces encountered the Panzerfaust extensively during the push into Germany in 1944 and 1945. Tank commanders learned to fear German infantry in ways they hadn't before. The doctrine changed. Tanks had to be accompanied by infantry to clear out potential Panzerfaust positions, slowing advances and costing lives. But the story of the Panzerfaust doesn't end with World War II. In fact, its real legacy was just beginning. When the war ended, Soviet forces captured enormous stockpiles of Panzerfausts. They studied the design carefully, and what they learned influenced Soviet anti-tank weapon development for decades. The famous RPG-7, which became possibly the most widely used anti-tank weapon in the world, borrowed concepts directly from the Panzerfaust. The Americans were equally impressed. U.S. Army ordnance officers examined captured Panzerfausts and recognized their potential. This research contributed to the development of American anti-tank weapons like the Bazooka's later improvements and eventually weapons like the M72 Law, which entered service in the 1960s. The concept of a disposable, shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon had proven itself so thoroughly that it became a standard part of modern infantry equipment worldwide. Today, nearly every military in the world issues some form of man-portable anti-tank weapon to infantry units. The lineage traces directly back to that simple German tube from 1943. Think about recent conflicts. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Ukraine, handheld anti-tank weapons continue to be devastating tools. Modern versions like the Javelin or NLAW are far more sophisticated than the Panzerfaust with guidance systems and advanced warheads. But the core concept remains the same. Give infantry the ability to kill tanks. The war in Ukraine has shown this principle in stark relief. Ukrainian forces have destroyed hundreds of Russian armored vehicles using modern anti-tank weapons. These weapons, descendants of the Panzerfaust's design philosophy, have arguably been more effective at stopping Russian armor than Ukrainian tanks have. So what made the Panzerfaust so special? Why did this cheap weapon become so legendary? First, it democratized anti-tank warfare. Before the Panzerfaust, killing a tank required specialized equipment, extensive training, and often a lot of luck. The Panzerfaust put tank-killing power into the hands of anyone who could shoulder a tube and pull a trigger. This fundamentally changed the nature of armored warfare. Second, it proved that sometimes simplicity beats sophistication. German engineers could have tried to create something more complex, more accurate, more advanced. Instead, they created something that worked reliably under the worst conditions imaginable: cold Russian winters, bombed-out city streets, muddy forests. The Panzerfaust didn't jam, didn't require maintenance, and didn't demand skilled operators. Third, it showed the power of shape charge technology. The physics behind the Panzerfaust warhead was cutting-edge science applied to a crude delivery system. This combination of advanced explosives technology with simple mechanics became a model for future weapons development. Fourth, it demonstrated how economic factors shape warfare. The Panzerfaust's low cost meant Germany could produce them in quantities that would have been impossible for expensive weapon systems. In total warfare, quantity has a quality all its own, and the Panzerfaust had quantity in spades. But there's a darker lesson too. The Panzerfaust extended a terrible war. In the hands of poorly trained teenagers and old men during the last desperate months of fighting, it caused countless deaths on both sides while doing nothing to change the inevitable outcome. It's a reminder that weapon effectiveness can prolong suffering even in lost causes. Let me paint you one more picture to bring this all together. It's April 1945. The war is clearly lost for Germany. Soviet forces are fighting street by street through Berlin. Among the defenders is a 17-year-old kid who was attending school just months earlier. He's been given minimal training, a uniform that doesn't fit, and a Panzerfaust. He's terrified. The Soviet T-34 rumbling down the rubble-strewn street represents years of superior Soviet industrial might, experienced crews, and overwhelming force. Everything about this situation says the teenager should be crushed. But when that tank gets within 50 meters, the boy shoulders his Panzerfaust. His hands shake. He can barely see through the dust and smoke. He pulls the trigger almost by instinct. The warhead streaks out, covering the distance in a heartbeat. The shaped charge detonates on impact. The copper jet burns through the tank's armor in microseconds. Inside, the crew doesn't have time to react. The tank lurches to a stop, smoke beginning to pour from the hatches. This scene played out thousands of times in the final months of the war. A weapon that cost less than a pair of boots, in the hands of an untrained teenager, had just destroyed a vehicle worth thousands of times more and was crewed by experienced soldiers. This was the genius and the terror of the Panzerfaust. It compressed enormous destructive power into a package so simple that anyone could use it. It turned every soldier into a tank killer and every street corner into a potential ambush site. The technological descendants of that simple tube continue to shape warfare today. When you see footage from modern conflicts showing infantry destroying armored vehicles, you're watching the legacy of German engineers desperately trying to solve a problem in 1943. They created something crude, cheap, and devastatingly effective. They created a weapon that destroyed more tanks than any other of its kind. And they changed warfare forever, demonstrating that sometimes the simplest solution is the most revolutionary one. The Panzerfaust wasn't elegant. It wasn't sophisticated. It was just a tube, a warhead, and a trigger. But it worked, and in warfare, working is all that matters. That's why this cheap German launcher became legendary, and why its influence echoes through military arsenals around the world more than 80 years